Good day, and welcome to our webcast, Address Supply Chain Shortages and Delays, brought to you by CFE Media and Technology and sponsored by Worth. We're joined today by Mark Trowbridge, a principal with Strategic Procurement Solutions, LLC, and Patrick Lynch, a vice president with CFE Media and Technology. I'm Kevin Parker, an editor with CFE Media. Today's presentation can provide continuing education credits. CFE Media has met the standards and requirements of the Registered Continuing Education Program. Credit earned on completion of this program will be reported to RECEP at recep.net. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, manufacturers face key component shortages and higher raw material costs. Goods makers are experiencing record freight rates and delayed or canceled shipments. In response, immediate steps managers can take include focusing on production schedule flexibility, reviewing inventory policies, and implementing supplier risk management as key elements of supply chain sustainability. Longer term, experts expect to see use of technology to achieve better visibility into the supply chain, reshoring or regionalization of supply sources, and adoption of supply chain as a service model. Stay tuned to this webcast to review results of a survey of manufacturing and supply chain professionals about the current state of global supply chains, as well as discussion of how manufacturers can best respond. You see before you a few of the learning objectives for today's session. This event is a live educational webcast presented on October 28, 2021. The educational category is Technical, Health, and Safety. Here are some tips to help you get the most from today's webcast. If you experience issues with the slides or audio, refresh your browser or click the Refresh Media button under the presenter's picture. Control the volume of this webcast by adjusting the volume on the computer or on the webcast platform. For technical problems with the audio or slides, click on the question mark at the top right-hand corner of the screen to access a list of system checks to try before contacting an online technician. If you do need a technician, type a message in the Ask a Question box and someone will get to you as quickly as possible. The Ask a Question box is also used to ask the speakers questions. The live Q&A session will begin after the presentations conclude. Today's webcast is being recorded. You will receive an email within a week with the link to the on-demand event. To take the Learning Unit exam, use the Learning Unit Exam tab option at the top of your screen. The exam will open in a separate browser window. You can complete the exam after the webcast. However, the link will break when the webcast signs off. We'd now like to share with you a brief video from today's webcast sponsor, Worth. Welcome back. I'd now like to introduce today's speakers. Mark Trowbridge is a principal with Strategic Procurement Solutions, LLC, a provider of supply chain management advisory services. His corporate career included key sourcing and contracting leadership roles with Catalina Yachts, at that time the third largest global producer of pleasure craft, Delta Airlines, and Bank of America. In the consulting space, Mark's firm has been privileged to advise clients that include Apple, Kraft Foods, and LG Electronics, to name just a few. Patrick Lynch is a vice president with CFE Media and Technology. His responsibilities include identifying, directing, and streamlining all revenue-generating opportunities across the organization. This includes the successful development, marketing, and commercialization of new products and services. Prior to this, Pat held a variety of roles at CFE, including serving on the executive team as vice president, product manager of its SaaS division, that is CFE Technology, and project manager for a variety of digital initiatives. Pat has a bachelor's degree in journalism and mass communications from the University of Iowa and an MBA in product development from Loyola University. He notes that his professional experiences have enriched his educational background. Patrick, welcome to today's webcast, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Kevin, and good afternoon, everybody. Today, for the first part of the presentation, we're going to go through research and data from our most recent global supply chain challenges research project we did in September. I'll go through the introduction and background and the methodology for this. This was conducted by our research department here at CFE Media and Technology. We had the survey open for about 9 days from September 21st through September 30th. We had 129 responses, and we offered an incentive for a drawing for a $100 Amazon gift card. The survey participants are primarily the qualified subscribers from Control Engineering, Industrial Cybersecurity, Pulse, and Plant Engineering. And we did validate their email addresses against our audience database to confirm that they were qualified readers of these magazines and they had credibility in terms of their responses. Since we're going to be going through all of the research itself, I'm going to skip through this summary of findings tab. You will get a copy of this presentation at the end. Consider this kind of the executive summary of everything we discussed here today. From a respondent location, this was primarily a North American survey response. As you can see here, it was evenly distributed throughout the United States. We did have some participants because we are a global brand. We had folks from Asia, Europe, South America, and Africa participate in the survey. When we get into some of the data points and some of the questions, we really shaped a lot of these questions around how our audience or our subscribers responding to the global supply chain crisis. How are they adapting? How are they evolving? And we wanted to take just a snapshot in time of kind of where they sat. And then from there, we wanted to follow up with additional research projects and surveys related to this topic to see if we could continue to bring a resource to our industry about the issues associated with global supply chain and how the manufacturing and engineering community can respond to that. So up on the screen, you should see the inventory to sales ratio. And we asked these survey participants or the engineers over the past several months, has the inventory to sales ratio for your plant's manufactured goods risen or fallen? And you can see here, almost 40% said that it has fallen during that time. And that's not unexpectedly so, because from a standpoint of the inventory or the just-in-time inventory or lean inventory strategies, we've seen this pretty consistently, that there's not a lot of inventory on the shelves. And when you attach a supply chain crisis on top of that, it's going to put a constraint to a ratio like the inventory to sales metric. In regards to the level of increase for the cost of goods, you can see over on the right-hand side of the graphic that there's a pretty significant increase in cost over the past year for almost all of these items. Basic commodities at about 12%, cost of shipping goods, 12.5%. But by far and away, the electronics and semiconductors were almost 14% increase in cost over the last year. So what this is telling us is that our manufacturing audience has an increase in cost of goods. They need to find ways to save costs. They need to innovate. They need to either automate process, and you'll see that throughout a lot of the data here, that the subscribers, the survey takers, for this particular survey really are being forced to adapt because of kind of the macro climate they're operating within. On average, in the past month, we asked what type of delays. Were you experiencing delays? And then how big were the delays? Almost 85% of the survey takers said yes, they were experiencing delays. And on average, the delay was 6.5 weeks. I would imagine that number is probably going to get worse before it gets better. But even when you look through some of the data here, and you could see that 9 to 12 weeks, 13 to 16 weeks, 17 to 20 weeks, or more than 20 weeks, we're really looking at almost 25% of the survey takers were experiencing a delay of 9 weeks or more. So this is something to factor in both on the manufacturer and the supplier side about what kind of delays can realistically people expect over the next few months. There was really no key industry that's been impacted. The takeaway on this is that almost all manufacturing industries are being impacted here. And the challenge here is that all of the industries listed, a lot of times they fit into each other. So for example, a semiconductor chip and a delay in the production or the shipping of that is going to impact further down the line the automotive industry or the electronics or things like that. So really, this is something that's impacting all industries, some a little bit more than others, but a lot of times you're seeing this kind of avalanche effect between each industry, where the parts and components industries are ultimately impacting the final discrete products down the chain. Not unexpectedly, we've asked how the manufacturers have responded to the supply chain shortages. Well, they've extended delivery times, they've raised the product costs, and they've identified, qualified, and signed on new suppliers. You can see here, not a big difference between kind of bottom of the chart there, the hired new employees, and the top of the chart there, the extended delivery times. Not a big dispersion, and what that tells me is these manufacturers are trying a whole variety of things. Is there any silver bullet right now? I don't think so, and it doesn't appear that way, at least according to the data. But in the grand scheme of things, they're trying a variety of these things, and hopefully, the response they're creating is going to get better results down the road, rather than just trying one thing and hoping that's the only way out of this problem. In terms of a forecast, I don't know if anybody has an exact handle on this, but our manufacturers are forecasting that from the end of September 2021, on average, they were saying they expect this to last at least 11 months. Depends on what data source you go to. Some are saying a little bit less. Some are saying almost twice as long as 11 months. But right now, for our purposes, our audience is telling us it's going to be about another 11 months. So that carries us into near the end of summer 2022. We started to get into questions about supply chain fragmentation. Almost 2/3 said that their supply chain was increasingly fragmented. Diving into some of those details, when we asked what was the primary cause of the supply chain issue, of course, I don't think there's one specific cause for the supply chain issues, but you could see here that some of the verbatim answers over on the right-hand side about the aluminum shortage, the ability to ship product due to component availability. A lot of these things are, I would say fairly common answers. I think the interesting thing on this is that you're really looking at, almost 80% either have not identified the primary cause or they don't know what it is. So you're really looking at only 21% have identified the major constraint that are doing something about it. So this problem is still evolving as we speak. People are trying to solve it and workarounds. But I took away from this particular chart that, almost 80%, they're not quite sure what the cause is yet. They're still troubleshooting. Now, when we asked, has your plant's purchasing policies led to excessive concentration of key input production in a few firms and locations? Only 12% said yes. So this is the debate between having a consolidated supplier model or more of a specialized consolidated buyer where you work with the best product for a specific application rather than just one supplier. And you can see here that only 12% has really concentrated their efforts into from a key input production into a few firms and locations. 49% have not done that, and almost another 40%, they're not sure at this point. So when we get into some of the software and the technology about the supplier management or inventory management systems, you can see here when we asked, is your plant changing its supplier management or inventory management strategies as a result of the ongoing supply chain shortages? So about a third of the audience said yes, they were considering changing the inventory management strategies. In that particular industry, we wanted to know, okay, now that you're considering a change, what are the changes and attributes for supplier management that you're looking for here? How have each of the following attributes of your plant supplier or inventory management strategies changed? You can see here, identifying alternative suppliers was rated as the top item when it comes to significantly more important. What this should tell some of the suppliers out there is that, there's opportunities to qualify new suppliers, and that primarily in an industry where there might be, a few dominant players, this could be a chance where some of, the non-dominant suppliers might have a chance to win some business from manufacturers, because most of these manufacturers are telling us they're looking at identifying alternative suppliers. They are reviewing inventory policy and planning parameters, and they're prioritizing critical shortage by supplier and buyer. So those are kind of the top items that they rated as significantly more important because of some of these changes. Of course, everybody is very interested in whether or not reshoring or regionalization is going to occur. On average, the plants who were considering reshoring, their timetable was, in a period of 6.5 months from September 2021. Now, is that realistic? It's to be determined. But at this point, our survey takers are telling us they're considering it more than they have before, and their timetable is to, if possible, reshore or regionalize some components of their supply chain within 6.5 months. So not unexpectedly, the question about have lean inventory strategies made your company more vulnerable to supply chain? You can see here that, overwhelmingly 61% say yes, they made, the lean inventory strategies have made us more vulnerable to supply chain disruption. When we got into a little more specifics and follow up to that question, we wanted to ask, has your plant been impacted by any of the following? Internal constraints related to COVID-19, the U.S. labor shortages, the internal slowdowns of the ports. I think these are all, very common answers. I think the labor shortages is going to end up being kind of the first place item, or probably the catch-up item. If we did this survey 6 months from now, I have a feeling the labor shortages are going to be at the top of this list. I was just reading an article last night that there's almost 480,000 warehouse jobs open right now, distribution and sorting facilities. So with 480,000 open labor positions in warehouse and distribution facilities and more than 80,000 trucking and transportation openings, there's a lot of labor shortages that can't go, underreported or kind of unconsidered in this, where hopefully we're moving out of the internal constraints created by COVID-19, but the labor shortages seems like it's going to be more of a long-term impact. Getting into kind of the final section here about, technologies and cybersecurity, we wanted to figure out that since there's been this supply chain crisis, are you more or less likely to buy automation and controls products? And as you can see here, the vast majority, more than 2/3, are saying yes. I'm either much more likely or more likely to consider buying automation and controls products. And the primary motivation behind that was they're interested in buying those because they want to create efficiencies. They want to try to lower their costs if they can by creating more automation on the plant floor. This is certainly good for the control engineering audience that we represent at CFE Media, because they've obviously been big proponents of automation for years, and the suppliers in that industry have been advocating for more and more adoption of automation and controls on the plant floor for this specific reason. So this was certainly encouraging. This particular question asks, For those who already buy automation and control products regularly, are you going to continue or be more likely to buy? As you could see here, similar responses. They're going to continue to buy certain automation products, like they have in the past. The likelihood to switch vendors due to longer lead times. This is something from the supplier side that I would take note of, is that we're really looking at almost 2/3 said they're either much more likely or more likely to switch vendors due to the longer lead times. I don't know if switching vendors is always the answer, but it certainly seems like if we ask this question during different times, I would imagine those numbers being much smaller. The likelihood to switch vendors be a lot less than it is right now when it comes to something like this, or the current market we're in. The importance of supply chain resiliency and interoperability. Prior to COVID-19, we wanted to figure out how important was supply chain resiliency and interoperability. You could see here that both very important and important rated at the top of the list. So resiliency and interoperability are key for this particular audience, and they remain so. The final handful of slides that I have are related to the security and cybersecurity section. More and more emphasis is being put on monitoring all components of this. Hello?
Hello, Patrick, are you there?
Okay, great. Sorry, I had a audio issue there. It sounds like we're back. So we're back to the slide. The confidence in the third-party vendors. So back to the cybersecurity question. The confidence in third-party vendors, what was a little disconcerting about this is that when we asked our survey takers about what level of confidence do you have cybersecurity of your third-party vendors, 49% said they have some confidence, but only 28% rated it as high confidence. And so the question is, well, if almost 3/4 said that they don't have a very high rate of confidence in their suppliers, what can be done to fix that problem? What can be done to maybe protect other components of the supply chain security? And so some of the follow-up questions we had is, since May, there was an executive order passed about software bill of materials. And this was passed in May, and we were pleasantly surprised to see that with an increased emphasis on security, cybersecurity being that, we saw that, 42% said yes, the software bill of materials has helped with cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the supply chain. We expect that if we ask this question 6 months from now or 12 months from now, the adoption of the software bill of materials is going to, make this yes part of the pie continue to go up, right? The transparency about who is actually interacting with your supply chain at every step is certainly going to help things. How protected are they? So we have a magazine, or actually a website dedicated to covering the cybersecurity market, and they talk about this topic on a regular basis. This is certainly something to keep an eye on. Valuable attributes of software bill of materials are as expected, that it provides increased visibility, increased confidence in security assets, and simplified vulnerability management. So that's really what our audience is looking for when they say these are the most valuable attributes of these software bill of materials. And then from a frequency of how often are certain departments involved with supply chain security, you could see here that about 42% of the IT team's time is spent focusing on supply chain security. OT managers, you're really looking at 24%, or about a quarter of the time. Automation and control engineering, almost a third of the time. And supply chain managers really only at kind of that 20, 22, 29% of the time on average of the year. So question is will that continue to go up? Will these software bill of materials help people focus in on specific aspects of their supply chain security? Will they spend more time on it? I'm probably going to ask questions like that in follow-up surveys. And then finally, from just a verbatim standpoint, we wanted to show some of the bits of advice we're hearing from some of our folks out there, where really we wanted them to know, please provide advice to other peers who might be reading this. And you can download this, as part of the presentation here, and you can see some of them. But, as always, the concept of don't overpromise and underdeliver, everybody is operating in very similar environments. So whether it be suppliers or whether it be the output, really everybody is operating under the conditions of a supply chain in a variety of ways. How we manage our way out of this and are we better in the future are questions still to be answered. But overall, people were optimistic that we can work through this and we'll get through it together. But overall, there's certainly challenges. Hopefully some of this data was helpful for everybody on this call. If you'd like more information or more questions, I'd be happy to take those during the Q&A portion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark, and he's going to go through his side of the presentation. Mark?
Thank you, Patrick. Some very interesting survey observations there, and thank you for that. Looking at the overall supply chain for many organizations, that's a topic that we could spend days talking about, and that would be an enjoyable conversation because there's so much to learn about what's changing right now. But I was asked to talk about two topics that are incredibly important to supply chain performance, and that's the topic of sustainability and related to that, supplier risk management. If we look at the average manufacturing company's supply chain, it's very interesting how much of the actual work in that supply chain takes place outside of the company walls. And so in my area of specialty, which is procurement, as well as supply management, looking at the upstream supply chain, those are goods, materials, and services that come into the organization, but also the downstream supply chain, which is how the finished products are delivered and related services are delivered out to the customer base. These are all very, very important issues, and we're going to focus on these two areas today. Next slide, it's just an overview of my background and the organization I'm with, as well as my contact information for people who have further questions down the line. The main purpose of this slide is just to show that in addition to actively working in the consulting field for 20 plus years now, I actually have held real jobs with a number of companies that had some significant supply chains. Catalina Yachts was the third largest manufacturer of pleasure craft in the world during my time there. Delta Airlines obviously is now the world's largest airline. And then in the banking world, Bank of America, believe it or not, had a very significant supply chain. In those days, we had 2.1 million square feet of distribution facilities. We brought in everything from ATM machines to furniture to information technology products. We configured those in-house. We delivered those out to 14,000 physical locations, and we also had a team of over 1,000 technicians, field service technicians, who maintained everything in all of our branch and office locations. So it was a very significant operation. So just wanted to share that with you. So let's talk a little bit about the risk landscape. If we look at risk overall, a major theme today, and this is a board of directors edict being pushed down throughout most publicly traded companies today, is that they have sustainable best practices. In other words, they can operate not only through times of disruption, but they can consistently perform no matter what type of risks are being thrown at them. That's a goal that many found out that they didn't have the resources to take care of during these COVID years. As a important aspect of that is the topic of enterprise risk management. And enterprise risk management is a process, a concept that leading organizations had deployed, but they had not deployed thoroughly throughout their entire operations prior to COVID. Subset of that is supply chain risk management. And then a subset of that, which is really the most important element of supply chain risk management, is supplier risk management. So we're going to talk about corporate sustainability, but we're going to talk about that in perspective of supplier risk management and performance. So the definition of what is called sustainability has evolved greatly over the last 5 years. It used to be in the past that you would have separate silos. You would have enterprise risk management, which some of you may be involved with for your organization. You would have supply chain risk management as a separate element with different people involved in that. And then you had the aspect of environmental footprint sustainability, which was looking at how an organization can have a zero impact or a zero footprint impact on the environment around it. And then finally, you had supplier diversity as a standalone outreach program for firms that were in the USA especially. The transition that has been caused by the COVID supply chain disruption is that many organizations' global supply chains are failing or they're having severe disruptions. Part of that is that the organizations realized they had offshored way too much of their overall supply chain to China and other low-cost countries. And now with the decimation of logistics, international logistics, as well as the decimation of global travel, and suppliers just failing to continue business operations, all of a sudden just disappearing. I mean, Hanjin Shipping, one of the largest container shipping firms in the world. 5 years ago, all of the ships were moved into ports, the crews off-boarded, the keys were turned over to management, all full of containers, and nobody knew what to do about it. The company had gone bankrupt and ceased operations entirely. Things like that are happening more frequently, but they don't even make it up into the news media because of that, the overall supply chain issue. The problems that we're experiencing now have helped to evolve a definition of sustainability, sustainable business. Enterprise risk management is a core element of that, a zero footprint environmental impact, but done not in a traditional way, done in a cyclical business manner, where it's looking at the overall input and outputs of organizations and then the footprint that they create. And then finally, the social influence of the company and its products and services upon society, upon customers, and upon suppliers. So looking back not just to the well-being of customers, but also looking back at the well-being of suppliers. Now, 3 core pillars have been added or more formally defined as it pertains to sustainability. There's environmental sustainability, and that's examples would be minimizing supplier manufacturing waste, logistic choices to maximize supply chain efficiency, and having low-cost energy programs. Those would be 3 examples of that organizations can do. Social sustainability is making sure that in terms of the whole portfolio of suppliers that your firm works with, that you're having a positive impact on supplier diversity and that you're making sure you're reinvesting into the communities that are also your customers. You also want to make sure that there's suppliers, all of your suppliers and throughout your supply chain, there's compliance with labor laws and recognized standards, and you have protections against child labor, human trafficking, those types of things that overall do a negative impact on society. Final thing is that you have governance sustainability, and there are all sorts of rules and regulations pertaining to this that many companies don't even know they're obligated to, but they have penalties in the 6 to 7 figure range for any major corporation? Have you gone through a process to assure that each supplier has a valid corporate registry? Have you validated the supplier is not on governmental watch list? This could be everything from the U.S. Patriot Act OFAC list, where every major company is required to check all of your suppliers against the OFAC list once a year. Have you done that? If you're not, there's major penalties, including having your business shut down if you don't comply with that. Are there rare earth minerals violations in your supply chain? Terrorism links, environmental issues, those types of things. There are 1,500 governmental watch lists, depending on where you do business in the world, that you have to comply with for your supplier base. And then a final thing, and this was mentioned in Patrick's presentation, do you have a risk of cyber liability exposure of loss of essential company data, compromises going back into your own systems, things like that. Those are all very important to look at. Now, sustainability, lest you think this is a small thing, here's a couple of slides about this. PricewaterhouseCoopers has announced just in August that they plan to spend $12 billion and hire 100,000 additional employees in the next 5 years just to focus upon issues such as data privacy, diversity, and sustainability. Okay, that's adding a third to their workforce, and they believe those themes, sustainability being one of them, are so important that they're going to add that type of horsepower. Okay, now lest you think they're alone, here's Deloitte, and they were actually in advance of this. In 2018, they pointed out that sustainability is now being positioned at the top of board of director agendas and being pushed down throughout the organizations. And they commented that expanding enterprise risk management to include ESG risks can help connect risk, strategy, and decision-making, and can make companies more resilient and competitive. This was before the COVID pandemic. This was before the 2020 shutdown of the supply chain. And they were very, very prescient in what they were saying. Okay, next. Let's talk about the difference in perspective that companies and groups, such as the ones that you're in, have towards this thing called risk management. In the past, traditional risk management had been primarily tactical. There might even be a risk management department in an organization. It was compliance-focused, silo-based. Each business was asked to determine its own view of risk, and many times business decisions were not linked to the risk. And often they were supported by rules, but they were really self-performed by organization. A sustainable business risk management mentality is much more strategic. It's cyclical in terms of the business model that it embraces, and it's focused upon performance, and it's a consistent approach across the enterprise that's embraced holistically. It really is driven by a board of directors and pushed down through the organization, and that develops a risk-averse culture. So as you look at your own organizations, questions to ask are, which side of this balancing line are we on? Are we looking at this old school traditional risk management, or are we looking at making sure that a sustainable business is a capability we have, and we're going to be able to navigate through whatever disruptions happen in the marketplace? Now, the issue of supplier risk management, how does that impact a company's sustainability and ERM programs? Well, supplier risk management is looking specifically at every supplier in your supply chain. Now, I was just doing a spend analysis this morning for one of my clients, and clicking through in the tool we use for that. And this organization has about $1.4 billion in spend with its supply base. So medium to large size organization. So $1.4 billion, and it has 8,000 suppliers. So how in the world do you look at all of those suppliers, determine which ones are most critical, and many times that's done by Paretoing the whole thing into A, B, and C suppliers, and assigning risk elements to it. But how in the world can you have that visibility? Where there are some gee whiz tools that you can use today to have that type of visibility and address some of the concerns that were in Patrick's presentation. But it's interesting. Here was an interesting quote. This was actually a couple of years old, so it's pre-COVID. But KPMG quoted that since 2000, 52% of companies in the Fortune 500 have either gone bankrupt, been acquired, or ceased to exist. Those are fairly large companies, very large companies, Fortune 500, but 52%. Do you have visibility to what's happening with them? And more importantly, do you have visibility to what's happening to your A, B, and C suppliers that aren't even in the Fortune 500? They aren't publicly traded, and there's not generally available news information available for them. So big issue here. So what are some things we can do in enterprise risk management and supplier risk management? First, we need to identify what are the potential risks that we're going to be experiencing, okay? Now, tied to that is a second question. What are the opportunities? I guess we should probably spell opportunities in the traditional way with two P's, but I'll correct that later. But what are the opportunities that those risks could potentially threaten, okay? Are they opportunities that are just in conducting business in a consistent and stable way based on our current size? Okay, certainly that's a risk. But more so, what does your senior management want to do? Are they positioning themselves to take over a competitor through a merger and acquisition process? The companies that have done a really good job of preparing themselves from a sustainability perspective before the COVID crisis, guess what they're doing right now? They're in a financial and an operational position to buy some of their competitors who haven't been so prepared. So what type of opportunities are there? That's just one example. The second thing is we have to assess the likelihood or the probability of a certain type of risk occurring, okay? Now, tied to that, it doesn't do us any good if we've got a very accurate percentage that this particular risk disruption is going to take place. We also have to assess what's the magnitude of that going to be. Now, that's not easy to do. We can't just crunch this out in Excel and come up with this. We need to put some strategic thinking into this and almost really do a SWOT analysis type of a look at our company's operations. But there's also certain types of risk where you cannot reasonably forecast them. You cannot mathematically determine the likelihood of something happening or even the magnitude. Those are known as black swan events. And black swan events in the world of enterprise risk management are ones like 9/11 and also COVID. Nobody could have statistically forecast those, but you can prepare for certain types of catastrophic events. Many times it's just by not being too greedy. It's not having only one supplier who's located in Western China, thinking that nothing will ever disrupt that supply chain. You need to have primary and secondary suppliers. You have to nearshore certain production capabilities or onshore it. And a lot of companies are learning that lesson the hard way. Third thing we have to do is determine if something does happen, one of the risks that we've identified, what is going to be our response strategy, and how are we going to monitor our progress in that response process? Fourthly is looking at implementing the response strategy. So actually planning it, putting it into effect, but then monitoring how it is working, and then making sure that we have the right processes, metrics, systems, and training in place to enact that. Now, an interesting study that was done by the CAPS organization, Center for Advanced Purchasing Studies, in combination with the Arizona State University Supply Chain Council, identified different areas of supplier risks and supply chain disruption that we need to look at. And each of these examples of each of these is captured here. We've got the availability of supply. What's the supply market capacity, the allocation? Are there material shortages coming up? What can we do? Are supply chains being lengthened, slowed down? What's the transparency? Logistics constraints, those types of things. We need to look at impacts on quality. Okay, quality can be a broad range topic. Here it's looking at costs, but also the quality. If there are changes in quality, what are the impacts on customers? What's the likelihood of counterfeit parts, which is becoming a larger and larger problem in the equipment spaces and also the hardware spaces and technology. Financial risks and exposures, legal and regulatory, data protection and security, intellectual property. We'll talk more about cyber liability later, but a trademark infringement or a patent infringement can take a supplier completely out of the mix that was a primary part of that. What type of brand reputation do your suppliers have? What type of negative news media? What type of information about plant shutdowns and labor strikes and things like that? Disasters such as force majeure events. What are the aspects that we need to plan for in our supplier and supply chains in terms of single or sole sourcing? Having global suppliers, where are our suppliers located in regards to our manufacturing? All of these things are things that we need to look at and consider as we explore the topic of supply chain disruption. Now, the same organizations put together this ranking of the sophistication of a supplier risk management maturity concept for different companies. And this is something that you could sort of benchmark to your own organization. And it goes from foundational, where supplier risk is not really proactively managed. There's no policies, that you have a few siloed ad hoc processes where somebody in finance will occasionally run a D&B report on a supplier, or just on your top 10 suppliers, but you're leaving everything up. You have no visibility to anything else. Structural is more advanced, where you have more effective approaches and processes, but you are only looking at key suppliers, the top 20%, top 15%, not really being aware that a lot of mid-range B suppliers and C suppliers are integral parts in the supply chain. And if any one of them fails, that can break down the entire process of interrelated chain links. Next level is having actionable intelligence. That's where you're being informed proactively as risk elements start to occur. You have automatic methodologies to identify any supplier that's going into financial default. Do you have notifications that across your entire supply base of all suppliers, and which ones are being subject to legal judgments or liens being filed against them, those types of things? Are you actively monitoring their certificates of insurance, which, by the way, all of the policies expire on different dates, and you don't know whether or not the supplier has that unless you're proactively getting a new certificate. Emerging influence is the fourth level, and this is where at a senior level, executive management is saying, we want to have this visibility. We want to be involved in the overall management of what's happening outside of our company walls rather than just looking at what's happening inside of it. And then there's also proactive risk reviews and supplier development reviews happening with your key suppliers and doing things like that. And the most advanced level is looking at suppliers, not only the prime suppliers, but also their key subcontractors, and taking that down a level so that now we have visibility to the entire supply chain, not just the prime suppliers. And it's a very, very actionable process. So those are two good benchmark studies that would be helpful as you look at your own organization and ask yourself the question, how advanced are we? This slide sort of illustrates that. You know, how does your organization stack up against the CAPS maturity model? How much of your own resources are consumed with data and document collection? You know, are your people sending out surveys to suppliers about their cybersecurity? Are they sending out surveys about their risk aversion? Are you collecting their contingency operating plans? Are you monitoring that? Are you evaluating their contractor safety and risk standards? Are you collecting insurance policies? All of these things take time and energy. And the question is, what are we doing now? Could we be doing more to provide better risk management for our supplier base? And then also, what could we do if we could get all of that done without effort? Now, there are numerous solutions for this that you can pay for that fill different pieces of this. But here's one, and again, this is an educational program. You can contact me for information about this example or others. But here's one that's a no cost, 100% of your supplier portfolio, managed through a secure cloud-based portal. And look at the things that they check off in terms of having a best practice supplier risk program. You get predictive experience supplier failure score monitoring. So gone are the days where you're trying to collect a balance sheet or a profitability statement from your suppliers. Instead, you're getting a credit rating on the supplier that gives you a predictive failure score on their financial stability. This organization collects all in proof of insurance and digitally, which is the first in the marketplace, and they do that at no cost. They check the supplier against the U.S. Patriot Act OFAC list and against 1,500 other watch lists. They monitor legal judgments, monitor liens. They actually have a third-party firm that does cyber liability scoring on the supplier's website and the supplier's operations. They monitor for negative news media exposure, and then they collect and manage supplier diversity certifications. This is just one of numerous examples that are out there, but there are remarkable tools that you can use to roll this out to all of your suppliers, and this is just one example where you could do that. Now, if you have any questions about this, or if you'd just like to chat with me about your own organization and discuss sustainability best practices, here's my contact information, and I'd be glad to chat with anyone. Kevin, back over to you to talk about questions.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. We've got about 8 minutes until the end of the webcast, so I'm going to be selective in the questions I ask. But first of all, what do you think the impact of the increase in inflation is going to have? I mean, I know you're too young to have been around in the late 70s, but that was really a devastating time for the American economy. Do you think that that's going to have a big impact on supplier relationships?
And Kevin, that question is for me?
Please.
Yeah. Well, I'd say inflation is a very real worry right now. It's going to obviously cause a lot of organizations to take a new look at make versus buy decisions in terms of insourcing manufacturing versus continuing to rely upon suppliers that have greater control over the costs. But it's also going to be something where organizations, in addition to determining what are they going to do via futures buying, and adding to inventory, if they see costs going up in the future, they can do certain things. They can do hedging, where they can do investments that swing in the opposite direction of the cost of a particular raw material. They can do futures buying. They can contract farther into the futures. One of the organizations I work with is a looks at the area of energy, where based on geopolitical events, energy costs are rising dramatically, and this organization helps companies reduce their energy costs but contract longer in the future, and then build safety clauses into their contracts to protect against that. That's the type of thing, and long-range contracting is something that should be done by many organizations. They should be looking long-term rather than short-term. And I'll tell you, the companies that are getting hurt worse right now are the ones that are who have been taking advantage of short-term market price decreases and doing things on a purchase order only basis, or only contracting for 1 year at a time. And now all of a sudden they're realizing that they're going to get beaten by their competitors, who might have paid a marginally higher cost with the same set of suppliers, but they contracted 2 or 3 years into the future and had protective language in place. It's really all about thinking long term.
Well, thanks, Mark. I think that really what our audience is most interested in is your reaction to the supply chain disruption as a supply chain professional. So I'm going to ask you another question that kind of follows on from your last answer. Do you think that this will also cause suppliers to adjust their just-in-time manufacturing strategies and move away from lean?
I think Patrick had a really meaningful slide on this that was very good, but it pointed out that that there probably is going to be a concern there, and the companies that have been playing it too tight with the suppliers are going to be more exposed. Now, just in time, or as I like to jokingly call it, BIT, barely in time, just in time manufacturing can work just fine if you're co-located with the supplier. Okay, but if you have tried to stage things out on a long supply chain where you have shipments showing up and staged to show up each week, a container of a material showing up once a week, just in advance of when it's going to be used, but it's coming from a supplier that's 6 weeks away or 10 weeks away, you're toast right now. And you are going to have major disruptions in your production. If you are an automobile manufacturing facility, but the company that manufactures the doors and the trunk lid for your vehicles is located a mile away and delivering on their own trucks, there's not as much concern there until that company starts to run out of steel to do their process. So it really depends. And it's intelligently looking at the supply chain. But I would say, as a norm, just in time, barely in time, and lean, they're going to have to take a step back and hold some slightly higher inventory levels, or much larger inventory levels, to provide the old expression of safety stock. That's going to be absolutely key. There's a great quote from an unknown CFO that I use quite a lot in training, and that is that inventory is a liability disguised as an asset. And so companies who are moving towards lean or are in a lean environment, their push has been to hold as little inventory as possible. Well, that's great as long as the pipeline filling your storeroom shelves is a full pipeline. But as soon as the pipeline breaks down, you have to reevaluate what levels of inventory you're going to be holding.
Great. Thanks, Mark. It's correct, as you say, that the survey indicated that companies were interested in moving away from lean. They were even interested in reshoring and regionalization of their supply chains. As a final question of the day, Mark, I know there's a lot of sentiment for reshoring and regionalization, but have you seen much in the way of actual indications of companies taking action in that way?
And my answer to that would be yes. And not just being purely objective and looking at the policies over the last few years, there was a big push to reshore towards America, beginning about 4 or 5 years ago. Part of that had to do with the changes in the corporate tax rate and the reduction of the corporate tax rate. and the movement of many suppliers back into the USA with actual production facilities. But some of it also had, had to do with pre-COVID, just the overall theme of Made in America. For those who are in the U.S., I know you probably have international listeners, but looking at the disruptions in the supply chain during what I call the lost year of 2020, that decision to offshore a lot of production, that's really being questioned now by a lot of senior executives, and they don't want to go through this again.
Great. All right, well, that's about all the time we have. I want to thank everyone for their questions. I want to thank Mark and Patrick for sharing their time and expertise. I'd also like to extend special thanks to our sponsor, Worth, for sponsoring today's event. Now that we're just about done, we'd like to hear how we did. The exit survey will pop up on your screen as soon as the webcast ends. Please take a moment because we use it to make our webcast better. Finally, on behalf of Plant Engineering, I'd like to thank you for attending. This concludes our webcast. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.